News Channel 5 Network. This is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. Today, we continue our conversations with our Tennessee congressional delegation members. So we welcome Democratic Congressman Jim Cooper from here in Nashville. Congressman, as always, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you, Pat. Always glad to be with you.
Now, the country's back at war in Iraq again. This time we're opposing the terrorist group ISIS. Part of that effort provides training to so-called moderate rebels who've been involved in the ongoing civil war next door in Syria. Now, you voted against that proposal, opposing President Obama. You had a whole laundry list of reasons why. Could you talk about that briefly?
Well, we're not only getting involved again in Iraq, but also in Syria and actually several other countries too, because it's all embroiled in that one region. We have great sympathy for the Kurdish people, and there are a lot of Kurds who live here in Nashville. But they're one of the few groups that's actually stood by the U.S. over the years. The Iraqi army that we'd supported turned and ran and turned over all their military equipment, U.S. military equipment, to ISIS, turned it over to the enemies. And the so-called Syrian opposition doesn't seem to be very well organized.
So should we just stay out of that thing completely?
Well, for the time being, I don't see a real good path to further U.S. interests. And remember, that's the only reason our men and women in uniform should be used, is to further U.S. interests. There are plenty of people who want us to get involved over there, but I don't see a good way right now to protect U.S. interests.
We had combat troops in Iraq. We took them out. Was that a mistake?
No, the mistake was the government of Maliki, the Shiite partisan who came into Iraq and demoralized the troops, removed most of the good commanders, sided way too much with Iran, and that really was the turning point, because that's created and perpetuated the Shia-Sunni split within this religion of Islam that really is the fundamental thing going on in the Middle East.
The major U.S. involvement at this point is an air war that's been being conducted in both Syria and Iraq. Do you see any signs it's having any impact? And the goal is to degrade or destroy ISIS.
That was the president's goal. Congress did not pass the president's proposal. It passed, but Congress had amended it substantially and really only authorized 90 days of train and equip for Syrian opposition. We have not voted on the airstrikes. I think there should be a vote on that in Congress, because Congress is given the power of the Constitution to declare war. Airstrikes can be effective in a limited pinpoint sense, but there's really no substitute for boots on the ground if you want effective military action.
Are we on the slippery slope back to putting ground troops in there one way or another? Because as you say, you can't really do anything ultimately to seize back power, seize back control, unless you have boots on the ground from somebody.
Well, that's exactly what I'm afraid of, a slippery slope, or some people say a camel's nose under the tent, and then suddenly we're dragged back into another multi-year conflict with no good result for the U.S., because we should only be involved if there are U.S. interests at stake.
Now, we have had some fortune, at least the president has, in getting support from other nations. France is involved, the UK, Australia, even the Turkish government says they're going to be involved, but it looks like we're already embroiled in a tactics or who goes first kind of thing for putting in troops or doing things. Turkey even wants us to get involved with attacking the Assad government in Syria, which we thought about doing before but didn't do. And now we're sort of on their side in opposing ISIS. This seems like a real mess.
It is a real mess, because a lot of our so-called allies really rely on us to do almost all the work. They might send over a colonel or, paint a flag on the side of one of our airplanes, but that's the extent of their involvement. Turkey's been particularly squirrely. They hate the Kurds and actually have compared the Kurds to ISIS, which is a terrible thing to do and grossly unfair. But it's really a 3- or 4-way conflict down there. It's kind of like three-dimensional chess, and we're not very good at those conflicts.
Now, the president's policies have gotten some criticism, as you might expect, from the other side of the aisle, but he's even getting some criticism from former cabinet members, they haven't left very long, and even from former President Jimmy Carter, who is also a Democrat. Is this kind of embarrassing for the administration?
Well, overall, I know the media has to stress the bad news, but the president won a bipartisan vote to get involved in Syria, and that was completely strong with Republicans. They actually voted more heavily for it than Democrats did. So in some sense, Congress is pulling together behind the president. Now, these kiss and tell memoirs are troublesome, particularly those published before the poor man has even left office. That really is not only impolite, but
you're talking about Leon Panetta right now.
Well, that's a bad one, and there have been several other ones. Not only Bob Gates, but Hillary Clinton. So you really need to have a decent interval there, because a lot of this so-called history really isn't history yet. We don't know the outcome of a lot of this stuff, and everybody's going to make themselves look good and try to make the other guy look bad.
Secretary Panetta, who headed both the CIA and later the Defense Department, said we're getting ourselves into a 30 years war. Now, that has a historical term if you go back into European history. Are we going to stay in that area that long and be at combat, really?
Well, I went back and looked at the history the other day. Since 1980, which wasn't that long ago, it was about 30 years ago, we've been involved in 14 different Middle Eastern countries militarily. 14 different countries. So a lot of folks date the conflict from the Arab oil embargo in 1973 and then the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Ever since then, we have been sucked into more conflicts than you can even count on your fingers in the Middle East. So it's really been going on a long time. The question is what we're going to do to remove ourselves from that. And the best news is American energy independence. This newfound oil in our own continent is just astonishingly good news. We need to do all that we can and use that blessing that we're receiving to wean ourselves as much as possible from the Middle East.
In the meantime, you and other members of the Tennessee delegation seem to want to have the president come back and ask for permission to do what? What is it that you want the president to come back and ask you to do, and what are you likely to approve, and what are you likely to say no thanks?
Well, the first thing the president should do is really ask us for a serious military strategy to try to do something, and then if he's serious about that, let's pay for it. We haven't been paying for our military now for 10 or 15 years. We didn't pay for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We largely borrowed that money from countries like China. That's embarrassing. Our military right now is in 7 more years of so-called sequestration, which are senseless, across-the-board cuts across our military. And that's not a great position to start fighting new conflicts from. So we've got to cure that budget problem first. Budgets determine all policies, and both the president and Congress have ducked that. So having an upfront vote in Congress would force fair consideration of not only the military issues, but also the budget issues.
Congressman Jim Cooper is our guest on Inside Politics. Another big issue facing this country is what to do about the growing problem or threat from Ebola. Back to continue that part of the conversation with the Congressman after this break.